You might even be in one right now. As valuable as learning how to find your flow can be, obsessing over finding it will most likely have the opposite impact. Like anything else, finding flow is a skill, and learning new skills can be tough and frustrating to learn. Not being able to find flow, even in a task that meets all the parameters of enjoyment, challenge, and timing that we talked about, doesn't mean the task isn't worth doing. If we start using flow as a precondition to get things done, we'll most likely get a lot less done. If flow doesn't come, it's all on us and all the other mechanisms we've built inside ourselves to deal with the internal triggers like self-doubt and external triggers like that dirty laundry ready to be folded and get the work done. Flow is a tool we can seek out to improve our lives. It's a mindset to help us boost productivity, conquer challenging tasks, and lean into our creativity. The promise of being able to turn off the outside world and turn on the most positive parts of our inner world is a learning and something to strive for, but as soon as we get too fixated on achieving these things, we might lose what flow is really about. Suppose there is a couple, the Joneses, who just gave birth to a baby boy named Sammy. As they stand together in the hospital gazing down at their newborn, they share an awareness that the life ahead of Sammy will be filled with an indeterminable amount of both pleasure and suffering, happiness and heartbreak, miracle and tragedy. Then in an instant, the harsh reality of their baby's future hits them, and for a fleeting second, they look into each other's eyes and think, if we hadn't given birth to him in the first place, he wouldn't suffer anything. Right there, they both make the decision to give Sammy the best life they can, and to prevent him from experiencing as much suffering as is humanly possible. The Joneses are great parents for thinking this, but in the words of David Benatar, it is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is to not bring those children into existence in the first place. This is the philosophy of antinatalism. It's the thought that human procreation is unethical, the belief that any action with suffering as its byproduct should not be.
Bro, what is this? Bro. Yeah. You started talking after, that's popping up.
As well. Although the roots of antinatalism can be traced all the way back to ancient Greece,
The last one I listened to,
experienced a particular spike in
yeah.
popularity over the last decade or so.
You ever notice when you talk
This
about like
research
fast
seems to
food
be
and Apple
credited
pop
by
up on your
Nietzsche
phone?
to the South African philosopher
Nah,
David
I
Benatar,
know.
who
I've had
authored
it so
maybe the
many
most
times.
widely known literature on the subject.
Show me right there.
In his book Better Never to Have Been, Benatar argues that his antinatalist views come from a place of
Those
compassion,
locked in.
stating that the only way to truly prevent the suffering that comes with existence is to not exist in the first place. And he isn't the first person to have this thought. The Greek tragedian Sophocles once said, "Never to have been born is best." Heinrich Heine, the 19th century German poet, wrote, "Sleep is good, death is better." But of course, the best thing would have been to never have been born at all. And the preacher in Ecclesiastes said, "Strive praise the dead that are already dead more than the living that are yet alive. But better than both of them is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." So as you can see, the school of thought that non-existence is inherently better than existence isn't a new one. In recent years, though, these ideas have given rise to an antinatalist belief that seeks to end human procreation. There are two different schools of thought under the antinatalistic argument. The first is the one David Benatar makes when he says we should spare the unborn from suffering that is life. This argument centers around the harm in which existence poses on the baby being born. On the other hand of the spectrum, the misanthropic arguments for antinatalism that center more around the harm that babies being born will go on to inflict upon one another, other animals, and the environment as a whole. To put it into context, consider this. The average carbon footprint for a single person in the United States has been estimated to be around 16 to 20 tons per year, meaning that just fulfilling daily necessities such as driving, showering, eating, and using electricity has unimaginably damaging consequences towards the environment we live in. So to antinatalists, the most ethical way to solve this problem is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Both antinatalist arguments, whether philanthropic or misanthropic, are centered around one core problem, suffering, and one proposed solution, to stop giving birth. And you might say, well, what about all the good things in life? Why would you not want a child to experience all of that? Well, antinatalists believe that in human life, there is an inherent imbalance or asymmetry between pleasure and suffering. Let's take Sammy, for instance. Because Sammy has been born, he would experience pain, which is bad, and pleasure, which is good. However, if Sammy was never born, then he would never experience pain, which is good, and he also wouldn't experience pleasure, which is not bad. The argument, therefore, is that the presence of pain will always be objectively more harmful than the absence of pleasure, and so it makes sense to preserve the absence of pleasure rather than introduce the presence of pain. Everyone suffers from being human, but no one suffers from not existing in the first place. A second argument that followers of antinatalists bring forward is the hypothetical consent argument, which states that no one can consent to being born. Consent is simply defined as the act of giving permission for something to happen, and according to the antinatalist hypothetical consent argument, the unborn cannot give permission to being brought into the world, and so, as a result, the act of procreation should be seen as non-consensual and therefore unethical. If we're focusing solely on the information we have about free birth that is scientifically provable, then the hypothetical consent argument is pretty difficult to argue against. But of course, as you know, the full extent of our pre-birth experience isn't yet known by scientists or even anyone for that matter.
I am a psychologist, and I know that there are depths of the mind that remain untapped for most of us in our normal business of going about our affairs.
This uncertainty opens up the door for a wide array of pseudoscientists who seek to explore the nature of our pre-birth experience using methods which, although can't be definitely proven by science, still add some thought-provoking counterclaims that are worth considering. One of those pseudoscientists is Helen Wambach, who hypnotized 750 subjects in the 1970s and asked them the question, "Did you choose to be born?" The responses she aggregated were quite staggering. 81% of Wambach's subjects reported that they did choose to be born, while 19% reported that they were either unaware of the choice or they got no clear answer to that question. Of course, again, research and findings gathered from hypnosis can't be scientifically proven. But in the face of the seemingly unknowable, studies like this pose at least some perspective that should not be disregarded entirely. However, focusing back on the data that we do have definitive answers to, consider the story of Gold Mana, written by Sienna Schifrin, which is used by antinatalists as an example for the hypothetical consent argument. Gold Mana is a wealthy man who lives on an island and decides one day, for reasons unknown, that he wants to donate some of his wealth to his neighbors on an adjacent island. These neighbors are comfortably off, but would still objectively benefit from his donation. Unfortunately, though, due to historical tension between governments of these neighboring islands, Gold Mana and his agents aren't able to physically go to the adjacent island, nor are they permitted by law to even communicate with the people living there. But still determined to donate, he handcrafts several heavy cubes of gold, each worth $5 million. Then he...
Hey folks, I want to show you something. This is my Mac after I've used Clean My Mac. Looks like I've got 22 gigs more free space.
It's going to be the talk
than
about
before
cleaning
I
your Mac a
started.
lot. And you got
Absolutely gorgeous app to get rid of clutter.
Yeah, he's gonna crack a
especially
sale.
duplicates.
He flies his plane over the neighboring island and drops the cubes down to the ceilings underneath. He tries to avoid hitting people with the cubes, knowing that it could cause injury. But eventually, after gifting several people with the wealth, he hits one person, who the story aptly names Unlucky. The impact of the cube breaks Unlucky's arm, yet at the same time it grants them $5 million. Schifrin acknowledges that, on the one hand, with all the elements of the story considered, Unlucky was an overall beneficiary of Gold Mana's actions, as the $5 million that they received is enough to cover the cost of the broken arm and then some. Yet on the other hand, Schifrin argues that an objective wrong was still committed by Gold Mana, since the harm he inflicted on the Unlucky wasn't consensual, despite how much the payout might have outweighed the harm. Unlucky was living a decent life before Gold Mana came into the picture. His life wasn't pleasurable, but he didn't suffer any pain either. After the cube dropped on his arm, he experienced both pain and pleasure. In light of all this, we have to ask the question, which then is better? To have experienced pain and pleasure, or not any at all? I think to answer that, we have to define what pain, or in this case, suffering, is. For millennia, philosophers have traveled to great depths to dissect what this experience really means and why it corresponds so closely with human life. One of those philosophers was Fyodor Dostoevsky, the infamous Russian novelist whose work contemplates the spiritual dimensions of human psychology in extraordinary depth, and who invented the genre of existentialist literature. Dostoevsky's final book, The Brothers Karamazov, tells the story of three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, whose opposing spiritual and world views are forced into question on their task of solving their father's murder. The novel's most theatrical ideological clash occurs between Ivan, the middle son who is broken away from his religious family in pursuit of a more Western and rationalist education, and Alyosha, the spirited younger brother who has chosen to remain attached to his family's faith. Ivan claims that due to the existence of suffering, and more specifically the suffering of innocent children, to believe in the omniscience of God and the goodness of people is illogical, impossible, and impermissible. He laments, "Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony, pray tell me what children have got to do with it. It's quite incomprehensible why they should have to suffer." Through the character of Ivan, Dostoevsky paints a clear picture of a man whose compassionate intellectualism supersedes his faith in humanity so far to the point where he rejects the idea of human life altogether. Sound familiar? Several parallels can be drawn between Dostoevsky's Ivan and Benatar's Antinatalism, as both believe that if suffering is so synonymous with human life, then non-existence is the better alternative. This argument Ivan poses is more broadly referred to as the problem of evil, and it is one of the most ancient and compelling defenses against the belief of God that exists in philosophical literature to date. The argument's possible origins have been traced back to Epicurus, an ancient Greek sage, who famously asked, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he isn't omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" The last question, whence comes evil, or in other words, where does evil come from, is yet another heavily debated subject which is, of course, ultimately unanswerable. However, antinatalists would likely argue that whatever origin or meaning suffering may carry matters little, as it is irrelevant in the face of suffering's devastation. And in a sense, I completely agree, as searching for meaning to assign to suffering can so easily become a slippery slope which leaves people and the suffering of others. Yet, at the same time, the practice of assigning meaning to suffering can also be a powerful coping mechanism, which can transform the internal world of a person who is tasked to live with its heavy burdens. The inside, like most things, possibly lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes and differs from person to person. In a way, both antinatalist philosophies and the ideas of Dostoevsky's Ivan challenge us to come to terms with the reality of human suffering. Every day we're faced with things in our existence that are so factually unanswerable to the point that they can only be addressed through the lens of hypotheticals or faith. However, suffering, unlike these elusive, unanswerable existential questions, is very much real, tangible, devastating, overwhelming, and ever-present. You turn on the TV and hear one that news story after the other. You go online and are reading stories of corruption, human rights violations, and wars all around the globe. With humanity suffering even more prominent now that we have access to world news at our fingertips, it's no wonder then that arguments for antinatalism are becoming more and more compelling and sacralized culturally. In the end, we're faced with one question. We're faced with all that we know to be completely true about the reality of suffering. Should you choose to believe that human life isn't worth creating, or that it would have been better if you hadn't been born? Or do you choose to still have faith in that intangible sliver of hope that there is some larger reason for your coming to this earth in the first place, despite the suffering that your existence entails? No matter which side of the fence you stand on, I think it's important to acknowledge questions of this nature, questions of faith. It's because our attitudes towards and surrounding all that is unanswerable about our existence ultimately forms the philosophical bedrock of how we view the world and how we go on to act in our lives. Although Alyosha, Ivan's faithful younger brother, doesn't pose a very compelling counter-argument to Ivan's laments during their famous fight that I mentioned earlier.
I want to share my culture with new friends from around the world and feel supported along the way. I want to make my parents proud and graduate with the skills for my dream career.
I want to study in a university that is recognized around the world, giving me global opportunities. with you. And that's why I chose nihilism.
Tới giờ vẫn chưa làm được. Tôi set up trong nhà weird.
Bắt tay thực hiện, anh em mình tấn tới để có cơ.
The subsequent actions he takes throughout the rest of the novel go on to demonstrate Dostoevsky's final illustration of how one should conduct themselves even in the face of suffering and in relation
Nice
to the problem
emojis,
of
yeah.
evil. Aloysius' direction has him working on the ground, directly with the impoverished school children of his community, doing the tedious work of actually making their day-to-day lives more enjoyable and infusing their lives with a sense of meaning. Aloysius becomes an active participant, helping out in every instance of suffering he encounters. This is made particularly clear through his mentorship of a young impoverished boy whose suicide Aloysius prevents with his compassion. Meanwhile, Ivan spends the second half of the story dissolving into a state of delirium after realizing that his intellectual arguments against human life led to the murder of his own father, as they gave another man the confidence to abandon his faith and carry out an act of evil in the world. Dostoevsky's final message was that ultimately, the actions we take in the face of suffering matter more than the intellectual beliefs we hold and preach to others about the nature of suffering. To me, whether or not one chooses to believe that human procreation is ethical matters less than the quality of the subsequent actions which that belief system guides them to take in the world. Like the Joneses, would you be aware of the harsh reality of human suffering and prepare yourself to do everything in your power to protect the ones you love from it? Or will you simply throw your hands in the air and say, I didn't choose to be here anyways, so I don't care what happens? In the end, one should only feel confident holding beliefs against procreation after they can assess whether or not these beliefs can serve them within the effective means of coping and helping others to cope with the suffering directly within and around them. Because, again, whether we realize it or not, our beliefs about the nature of existence hold great power over our will. As is the only meaningful resource we have to combat the reality of
So I love my
suffering
brothers that, but at the end of the
that
day,
comes with our
I'm gonna always
existence.
be competitive against my brothers. I'm gonna want to be better, and I'm bringing them with me. But yeah, like if my brother sticks with that shit, then they're gonna be real excited and come to Uncle Ian's house.
Facts. And then how like our kids are just gonna like destroy him and everything.
They gonna love to come on. No way the video's over.
Hey, no, yeah, we make it fun.
Really.
Kids are like
And this
enjoy
is
it,
what makes it
like
different.
yeah, kids
This is
enjoy
the
it, like
interesting
sports.
in the world, but they just don't think humans are capable of doing it, at least in its entirety. Nihilists, on the other hand, do not believe in anything. They don't believe that there's evil in the world, neither do they believe that there's good in the world. In the mind of the nihilist, the world simply exists, and humans create the world, thereby creating good and evil.
Look, there's your garage
Let's
door.
take the glass cup metaphor for
There's some
instance.
Venus like
Optimists say you should see the
big
glass as
black
half full,
freaking
while
blacked out
pessimists say
truck,
you should see the glass as half
Lambo,
empty. Nihilists, they say throw the entire car
would probably be
away,
like that.
because what does it matter if it's full or
Like a
empty?
lamp truck or something.
Full, empty, good,
All
bad.
four
It's
blacked
all
out and the garage doors open.
We're all going to die anyway.
I can
Nihilism
see it
also
like the
often
pathway,
applies
like,
to several other
that's what it's
philosophies,
with
like
the trees and
cynicism
stuff,
and
and
apathy.
our house like
But
opening
again,
up like
they are all
you
very
won't
different
even expect
from
it
one another.
coming.
And correctly categorizing their thoughts into baskets may be harder than you think.
Like,
Some
when I told
people
you
that
that,
are
like,
always motivated by
kids, like
self-interest.
kids women.
They don't believe that anyone can have intrinsically good motives. They have no faith in the human species and believe that we're all entirely selfish, only trying for our own benefit.
That childhood dream.
The idea that humans are not good means that in the mind of the cynic, good exists out there somewhere, just not in humans. In the mind of the
Mine
nihilist,
was like,
nothing exists out there.
late
How do you
night.
feel the
There's no
passion?
good
I'm
or
thinking
evil.
of like
They don't see
my nephew
people as
looking
evil,
at it, you know.
neither do they see them as good, because they don't believe either of those things exist. They're simply traits
You're looking at,
of
like,
things.
The way the team's brainstorm is broken. They're working on a whiteboard that's disconnected from the rest of their work, and it's killing team creativity. But for the first time, there's a platform that fixes it by combining everything you need. Whiteboards,
I'm
chat,
waking up
and
with joy
projects
and
and
dress all black.
It's powered by the world's most creative work of AI, so you can create your best ideas and turn them into reality. Introducing
Apathetic people just don't care. They believe that there's meaning to life, but they simply don't care about it. Nihilism, on the other hand, is the idea that there's no grand
Yeah, I
design
can't
or
wait to
purpose,
sit in the family.
nothing to believe in, and therefore no meaning.
All that, bro.
This brings to mind the paradox of nihilism.
They're
If you believe in
Live in
nothing,
different states.
then that
and all
nothing
fly
becomes
out my
something
brother
that you
and his
believe
whole
in.
family.
But since you now believe in something, then there is no nihilism. Because
I
nihilism
don't
is the
deserve
belief that there is nothing.
Julian's.
Your jet out to go pick your
Nihilism is quite different from other philosophical ideas because it was first a literary invention before it ever became philosophical. As a result, it's not clearly defined as many of the other philosophies that exist.
First class.
Many different people explained it in many different ways. But eventually these different definitions got categorized, forming many different kinds of nihilism. There's political nihilism. Political nihilists believe that for humanity to move forward as a species, all political, social, and religious order must be destroyed. Then there's ethical nihilism. It rejects the idea of absolute ethical or moral values. With this type of nihilism, good or bad is only defined by society, and, as such, it shouldn't be followed if we as a species will ever attain absolute individual freedom. We can kind of just do whatever we want. And then we have existential nihilism. It's the understanding that life has no value
See
or
how we're
meaning.
gonna build it?
It's the most popular
Guys,
kind of
like, buy the
nihilism,
land and then
and
build
what we've been
it.
talking about for most of this video. For nihilists, the existence of things like the state, religious bodies, and even communal morality is a breach on our freedom as individuals. If we can't do absolutely anything we want to do, then are we truly free? Or have we simply bound ourselves by some kind of invisible mental chain for reasons we can't explain?
That's what my cousins did too.
One night I was scrolling through Reddit and I came across the question,
Yeah, they bought
if
that
you had
land
the
in
chance to
Oregon.
save your pet or a stranger, who would you save? An overwhelming number of people said their pet, pretty obviously. When one commenter was confronted, they simply asked the question, why do you think a human life is worth more than that of an animal? And no one really had an answer. Of course people tried to beat around the bush, but the question why was never answered. And that right there is the point of the nihilist. If we can't answer why we bind ourselves by these rules, then why do we choose to do it? Well, it might be because of the existential horror and the emotional anguish that comes with agreeing to the fact that life is meaningless. Think about it for a minute. If life is truly meaningless and everything we're doing has no value, then all the feats of science, the wonders of technology, things like space exploration and human rights movements, look at how far we've come. And then think about the fact that it all might just be a waste, a blip in time with no
You really had all this
whatsoever in
learning
the grand
that.
scheme of things. Knowing that all the things we experience, the ups and downs we go through, that in the end, it's all for nothing.
The mass all did nothing.
We aren't obligated to understand the chaos of reality, just
like
laugh at it. Friedrich Nietzsche was a strange philosopher because he argued both for and against nihilism at the same time. Arguing for, he explained that there is no objective structure or order in our world except for the one that we create for ourselves. He once said, every belief, every considering something true is necessarily false, because there is simply no true world. He believed nihilism would expose all of humanity's beliefs and truths as nothing but simply defective Western
being that man
mythology.
that can go anywhere.
As he
doing
famously said,
anything.
God is
So,
dead.
no, you can't,
now, he wasn't talking about the
Yeah,
actual
why?
deity of the religions. He was talking metaphorically about the power that religious orders held at the time, and how people were starting to chart their own paths, find their own meaning in life, denying what the status quo was at the time. But then, in the same breath, Friedrich argued against nihilism, saying that in the coming centuries, the advent of nihilism would drive civilization towards a catastrophe, a disaster waiting to implode, a river that has reached its end. And if you look at the most destructive civilizations of human history, we can clearly see that this is true. Long-standing cultural traditions, beliefs, religious institutions, and even financial systems are broken down, and nothingness starts to creep in. Think about it. If nothing matters, we're all just a random combination of transient
My
atoms.
last haircut
How can
wasn't
we
that
come
good.
to their objective
You left
about
that
the
line,
worst
I felt
humans
like-
ever lived for trying to wipe out an entire
Yeah.
culture?
Make sure
And
he gives you right, because
I'm gonna show him a photo, that's
all
what
these
you-
things
yeah.
are
No, yeah.
terrible.
But
We
you
think
like,
it's
you like
because we cannot
rushed
explain
it
why
and
we
cheaped
feel
down
like
like the
we
actual fade and
We
left the
can
line.
convince another person to follow.
He said it's good, I was like, nah, bro, there's a
And that
line.
is exactly
And
what
then he
Friedrich
actually faded it
Some
out.
people still blame him for the
Like,
Nazi
what are you
era,
doing, bro?
because although he saw all of these dangers, he still continued preaching nihilism. He believed that if we could work through the breakdown of civilization
That
and
wouldn't touch
that
that gun.
eventually cause, we
That
could create a
good
new
thing.
course of action for mankind. He believed that to move forward as a species, we must create a new morality, one that does away with the prejudice of what existed before.